Okay, so thanks for joining us all today. I'm really excited to talk to you about museums because that's something I really care about, evidently, and how they can become more welcoming spaces for neurodivergent individuals. I'm a Maltese Canadian graduate student of history at the University of Western Ontario. I'm currently living in Malta, so I'm about 6 hours behind most of you, I imagine, or ahead. I don't know math. I live with autism, ADHD, and sensory processing disorder, just so you have an idea of where I'm approaching this topic from. Yeah, so I'm sure most of you have visited very traditional museums, and we might not always realize what we need to make that space a bit more engaging and a bit more suited to the needs that we have. And I'm not saying that I have the solution for every part of that, but I believe that using 3D prints can boost this experience quite a bit. So just as a bit of background information, I've worked with 3D modeling and printing as a hobby more recently, but I've used it in other land contexts before. My first experience with this was when I was a collections manager at the Museum of Classical Antiquities at the University of Ottawa, alongside my colleague, Chloe Storm. We put together an accessibility initiative initially aimed at visually impaired visitors, but as the project progressed, I realized the potential for neurodivergent users as well. Collaborating with the engineering lab on campus, we 3D scanned a series of particularly visually interesting artifacts from a collection, including lamps, vessels, and even a pig rattle as seen on the screen here. The prints of these ended up being a huge success, which attracted a lot of social media traffic and departmental enthusiasm. And we were also able to give a public lecture through the Archaeological Society of America, Ottawa chapter on our work. And here's a quick video of the 3D printing process for one of the lamps that we did. So this actually took about 12 hours, but there you have it in like 10 seconds. More recently, I've been, sorry if you hear traffic, I'm in a really loud spot. More recently, I've been collaborating with the Department of Classical Studies at Western University to 3D scan and print artifacts in the departmental collection. We've been working with the Department of Anthropology to use their 3D scanner that was supported through the Social Science Student Donation Fund. And whilst it's a small collection that we're working with, we've been able to use them as pedagogical tools rather effectively in the classroom. And this is growing into a larger project involving around 4 graduate students now. So I want to talk a bit more about the 3D printing process and how it's used in this context. So for those unfamiliar with how 3D printing works, it's essentially layering plastic material, plastic or resin, one layer at a time to build up a whole item. The plastic or resin is extruded through a heated nozzle into these little tiny layers like you can see on this zoomed in image here. So on the left, you have the actual model itself. The middle is the layers, and on the right, you have a zoomed in picture to see all these tiny little layers grouped together. And for those that don't know, this is a Roman loom weight. So of course you can do just about anything with a 3D printer. Engineers typically use them for creating prototypes. You can make really cool toys with them. I've made some really awesome cookie cutters for my neighbor. But the key to getting the 3D scan to work in the context of artifacts is the scan. Getting your hands on a 3D scanner is quite expensive a lot of the time, so I'll have some recommendations for that later. But the great thing about scanners and artifacts is that some of the higher end scanners are really good at picking up every nook and cranny on an artifact. With this example of a cup here, it picks up even the tiniest of chips on the handle. So where these prints differ from traditional replicas is that they're much easier, cheaper, and faster to produce. There is only a fraction of the labor involved. No plaster ever needs to touch the artifact, and you can produce more and more for just mere pennies per print. These models are easy to produce multisensory experiences that neurodivergent staff, volunteers, visitors, or whomever can experience and learn from. They're bridges between the past that allow us to engage with history in a whole new way, to understand with our own hands how ancient objects were produced, the thought behind ancient engineering, the experience of eating and drinking, and so much more. I'm a big fan of Roman oil lamps personally, and sometimes it takes people a long time to look at one and actually understand how it worked. So in my experience of using the 3D prints, it's been very beneficial just to hand one to somebody, and just by looking at it, playing with it, they can typically figure it out for themselves pretty quickly, better than just looking at one behind a glass case. And also in terms of ancient languages and writing, being able to actually feel the grooves of the incisions on something like this can really help somebody grasp how these types of things were produced. Moving on, I want to chat a little bit about sensory sensitivities, which is something I'm sure we're all very familiar with. There's nothing I hate more than being in a place with bright overhead lights and crowds of people. Like this on screen is like my own personal nightmare. And in these types of situations, I find it very hard to also center myself and focus on what's going on, which is no stranger to somebody who has ADHD. But just incorporating something that you can actually focus your senses on a bit more can really help grow the experience into a positive thing for neurodivergent individuals. I love the idea of having autism hours at a museum a couple hours a week, but there's a lot more that you can do rather than just dimming a light switch. These prints provide a controlled and stimulating experience for exploration. The textures of the prints are predictable and consistent, and you can handle them however you like, whether that be roughly or throwing them or chewing them or banging them. Things that you can't do with traditional artifacts that you might want to do to fully understand how they feel and how they were used. And best of all, you can sanitize these really easily without having to consult a conservator. You can just use rubbing alcohol or soap and water or hand sanitizer like you would for anything else. And if it gets into a real mess, just print another one for like 25 cents. So I'm sure that most of us can understand why enriching experiences for neurodivergent people in museums is important, but I want to lay out some of my thoughts on this for those unfamiliar. Museums are not only stewards of culture and history, but they are publicly funded institutions that have a responsibility to ensure that their contents are fully accessible. As our understanding of neurodiversity grows, so does the realization that our traditional approaches to education and engagement need a little remodeling, quite badly. Neurodivergent individuals bring different perspectives to the table. We think, perceive, and learn in different ways that can enrich our collective understandings of the world when we're given the chance to contribute. Those of us who are neurodivergent and are employed or volunteer in this field understand that some things just aren't made for us. And I'm not here to say that 3D prints will fix everything, because they won't. But handling artifacts that have unpredictable features, textures, temperatures, weights, etc., can sometimes be the last thing you want to do on a day where you're already feeling overstimulated. Being able to work in a controlled environment, either with a print or digital model of an artifact, can be a huge relief to some. 3D printing in museums shouldn't just be about creating cool replicas, though honestly that is a really big part of it for me. It's mostly about expanding access. It's about bringing history to life for those who have felt disconnected from it before. I know at the age of 15, I wanted to work in museums for the rest of my life because I completed my mandatory high school volunteer hours at a museum and got the chance to work in collections and to maintain the exhibits. And without that experience of having hands-on time with artifacts, I know I wouldn't be as connected to history as I am now and working in the field as I am. But touching the artifacts isn't an experience that everybody craves. It's a big responsibility, it's risky, and it's a really big deal for some people. Handling a model, however, is low stakes and meaningful in a similar way, perhaps even more meaningful because you can handle it much more rigorously and understand how it worked in a more specific way. I want to talk a bit more here about the future and recommendations. If you, like most institutions, don't have a 3D printer or scanner on site, but you want to try this sort of thing out, I recommend trying to reach out to your local library. A lot of them now are starting to offer 3D printing services for little to no cost, which was a big shock to me when I first learned this, but I took full advantage. Shout out to the London Public Library and the Kitchener-Waterloo Public Library as well. So also, if you are connected to a university or have one nearby, look online to see if any of their departments operate a scanner or printing service in-house. They're often more than happy to collaborate. I also recommend providing training to museum staff, board members, and volunteers on neurodiversity and inclusive practices beyond the required intake accessibility training that often teaches less than the bare minimum. Equip your team with the knowledge and sensitivity required to create an environment that welcomes neurodivergent visitors and team members alike. And for staff members that are neurodivergent, just make sure that they feel listened to and have their suggestions addressed in some way, especially when it comes to sensory experiences. Also, please, please, please consider the ethical implications of replicating certain artifacts. Some artifacts are very sacred items that are only meant to be handled or viewed in certain contexts. Them being in a collection is often disruptive enough to their sacredness and to the group that they belong to, so please don't disturb them further by replicating them and putting them into an inappropriate context. In the same vein, please consider your use of human remains very carefully. Most remains in museum contexts have been considered inappropriate by their affected groups, so please do consider that carefully before scanning remains or giving them to visitors to handle. Finally, if artifacts are particularly small or shiny and are not being picked up by a 3D scanner, please consult a conservator before you douse them in baby powder or any kind of spray. That's all the recommendations that I have for now. I could give many, many more, but I'm going to leave it there. So to conclude, my call for action is very simple. Museums and other GLAM institutions, whether big or small, have an incredible opportunity to reshape the way we experience history. I urge us to embrace it as a gateway to empathy, curiosity, and deeper understanding of the past. So thank you for joining me, and I look forward to hearing from you if you have any comments or questions.